Today we're joined by Caroline and Hannah from our sponsors at Woods Oviatt Gilman to discuss some important tips for all of you snowbirds here in the 716. Thanks so much for coming in today, you two.
Thank you, Chelsea, for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Of course. Well, okay, we've thrown out the word snowbirds a lot, but I would love it if you could start off by explaining what that concept looks like and how it plays a role in your work.
Yeah, absolutely. So the concept of snowbirds is just essentially an individual who might live in New York State full-time, but you know, the winters here can be pretty rough, pretty snowy. And so this is a type of person who might then also spend an extended period of time, usually throughout the winter months, somewhere down south, typically in Florida. How it plays a role in my work. So I actually am licensed to practice law in New York State and Florida. So our firm sees a lot of clients who are snowbirds or do have some of this cross-state estate planning issues. So I work with them just kind of planning how to plan their documents and plan their estates for to account for the fact that they have property in both places.
Makes sense, okay. Now, if someone spends time in both New York and Florida, but they are technically a New York resident only, do they need a will in Florida?
That's a great question. So typically the answer is no. Generally, each individual only has one will that controls at a time. And that will is usually a document that is governed by the state in which that person is a legal resident. So what that typically means, for example, Grandpa Joe lives in Buffalo. He's a huge Buffalo Bills fan, but he also has a condo in Florida. Maybe he spends the months of December through March down in Florida, still cheering for the Bills, but from a distance. In that case, he would have one will, and it would be a New York will, because he is still a New York resident. Even though he spends time in Florida, he just has a New York will.
Okay. What about any other estate planning documents? Is there anything else snowbirds need to consider?
There are a few things to consider. So typically when we're looking at an estate plan, we think about a will, power of attorney, and healthcare proxy. So on a general level, power of attorney and healthcare proxy, these are two documents that operate while you're alive. The power of attorney is a document where you name someone to kind of carry out financial decisions on your behalf if you're unable to. Healthcare proxy works similarly, but for medical decisions. So when we're talking about these documents, unlike a will, you can actually have more than one. These documents are also extremely state specific. So we do oftentimes recommend that an individual who spends extensive time in New York, as well as Florida, they might have banks that they use in New York and also a bank that they use in Florida. So we want them to be able to have documents in place to help in both places. So we would recommend having a New York power of attorney and healthcare proxy, as well as a Florida power of attorney and healthcare proxy. And really the main difference is your Florida power of attorney goes on file with your Florida banks, New York power of attorney goes on file with your New York banks, and kind of the same from a healthcare perspective as well.
Now, what if the individual owns real estate in both New York and Florida, like you mentioned with Grandpa Joe, who owns a condo in Florida as well?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so that involves two estates when someone passes away. So you would have a New York estate that governs all the assets that are part of New York, which would include real estate, and you would also have a Florida estate. So obviously, the first thing you're thinking is, why am I having two? But it's because it's state law specific. So it becomes problematic for Grandpa Joe's family if now he's passed away and now they have to, administer a court proceeding in New York and also administer a court proceeding in Florida, and they're actually linked to a certain degree. One becomes the main estate, and one becomes the secondary estate, and it's based on residency. So even if it was flipped and you were a Florida resident, but you spent a lot of time in New York as well, your main estate would be in Florida, and your secondary estate would be in New York. And of course, that's twice as much work that the family would really have to deal with as well.
Okay. Is there any way to make that easier?
Yes. The most common way that we do that is we use a revocable trust. It's not the only way, but a revocable trust is something that can be changed. So you can have one trust. If you're a resident of New York, we would have it be a New York trust. And that trust would put the New York property in it and the Florida property. And not only have you now eliminated a second estate proceeding in one state, you can actually eliminate estate proceedings in both states with that. And if you decide to be a Florida resident after you're a New York resident, a lot of people do that. They might still have family here, but decide for a number of reasons to switch residency. You can actually change the document to become a Florida document, and nothing else really needs to change. It's seamless. And in fact, Hannah has talked about this more extensively because there's a lot more considerations that come into play, especially if you're a Florida resident with real property. Hannah?
Yeah, so I do talk about this in a lot of detail because, as Caroline mentioned, it's a pretty complicated topic, just the idea of kind of avoiding the court process after someone passes away. And that's actually on our firm's podcast, Into the Woods. I think it's episode 4, The Real Snowbirds of New York State. So a pretty clever title. But yeah.
Yes, and there's a way that you can do even like transition planning from eliminating extra work for your family, but also residency transition as well. So it's an easy way to do that depending on what stage of life that you're in.
All right, ladies. Well, thank you so much for giving us great tips. We know that this actually affects a lot of Western New Yorkers. So, viewers, if you'd like to learn more about our sponsors at Woods Oviatt Gilman and the resources they have for your estate needs, just visit woodsoviattgilman.com or call the number right there on your screen. Thanks so much for coming in today, ladies.
Thank you, Chelsea.